significant drivers why we are considering the use of data in higher education. One of those critical dimensions is that we are always seeing a need to increase educational opportunities. For example, MOOCs just surfaced that need by basically suggesting that there are other people across the world besides our undergrads and graduate students who want to also have some other lifelong learning opportunities, change their careers and upskill. I heard that's one of those critical dimensions as well you have here in Singapore, where your government provides certain funds for people potentially to change their careers and take some of the courses, whether they are MOOCs or something else. At the same time, we are also seeing a lot of push and insistence inside of universities to improve our teaching quality and improve student experience. Many of us are trying to flip our classrooms, trying to apply different techniques that are related to active learning. Many of us are trying to implement some of these things. However, the challenge is always with the growing student numbers, and you also indicated at the start of the session here in this school, we're going to have extra almost 30% new students inside of the undergrad student population. So the question is then, how we manage these bigger numbers, improve the quality, better engagement of our learners, and at the same time, we provide a good quality. So this is really what is happening in many cases, and in many cases in the world, we are also at the same time defunded. People are trying to address some of these challenges by creating new technology. And technology is, in many cases, something which helps us to get there. However, whenever we are increasing the numbers and also potentially implementing certain technologies, we are losing the kind of personal touch. We are losing the opportunities to get these social cues that are available based on which we can also potentially intervene and assist our learners. And so the challenge is that learning analytics is trying to take on, and this is where learning analytics tries to use data in a kind of a setup that is commonly available in most of higher education institutions. So that setup really involves two types of technologies. The first type of technology that is commonly available in any institution is something which is called learning management system. Yesterday, the nice people from your learning and teaching unit demonstrated your system. I apologize, I forgot how you actually name it. But it's a really kind of nice way how you are trying to deploy some of these learning opportunities for your students. The same type of technology is available in many institutions across the world, except that they are typically not having in-house developed technologies, but rather they are buying typically or using open source solutions such as Moodle. There's another type of technology that is also commonly available in any institution, and those are our student records, student information systems, in which we are trying to collect data about students' previous grades, socioeconomic, demographic variables, and so on. But then in many cases, people are trying to be innovative. When we are trying to promote different types of social networking opportunities for learners to establish their digital identities, to also leverage and harness the power of professional communities and get kind of linked with those international communities, also trying to kind of build information seeking skills or build reflective practitioners for different types of learning opportunities. In many cases, also in particular areas, we are trying to expand on different types of multimedia and increase the kind of interactivity of the opportunities that learners can afford to use while they are studying. Of course, while we are doing all these types of things, we also want our learners to be collaborative, and Carol is going to talk about some great work she's doing on different types of collaborative technologies. But then, one critical thing is all these technologies are web-based, they're digital, and no matter what we do, we are always doing a digital trace. And that's what learning analytics is trying to do. We are trying to leverage these digital traces by analyzing them with the methods that are coming from machine learning, data mining, social network analysis, natural language processing, text analytics, and other related fields, so that we can get some insights into learning, provide interpretations of those insights based on our practice, plus also based on the research that we have from the learning sciences, educational psychology, sociology, and in some cases philosophy. So that eventually we want to provide feedback to learners, again, that feedback to be grounded in educational research, but also in research that comes from information visualization and human-computer interaction. So if you didn't know what's learning analytics, that is learning analytics. really the key pointers with respect to learning analytics out of the formal definition of learning analytics is that is collection, measurement, analysis, and reporting of data about learners, and more importantly, or equally important, contexts in which learning occurs for the purpose of understanding and optimizing learning and the environments in which learning happens. So that's a kind of formal definition that was issued by the Society for Learning Analytics Research in 2011, just before we announced the call for papers for our first live conference. And we spent a whole deal of time thinking about this definition. I don't know if this disclosed. Anyways, so some of these kind of well-known examples of the use of analytics and education. I'm intentionally saying analytics and education rather than learning analytics because the first example I don't consider learning analytics. It really is a kind of a nice example that was, as Bob indicated, it's also his intro, was more focused on kind of these more deficit models. The problem of student attention. There was a problem at Purdue University in their engineering program of student attention. And they wanted to kind of address that problem of student attention by leveraging technologies that I just mentioned, leveraging data that were available in their learning management system. There was a Blackboard that they were using in their house, and also student information system. They developed a predictive model that was basically trying to gauge the risk of students of potentially failing a course early in some of these courses. And so the idea was basically to kind of present through the metaphor of traffic lights to both students and teaching staff some of these risk levels. High risk would be presented as a red light, no risk green light, and moderate risk as the kind of yellow light. Behind it, they basically triggered those lines based on the predictive models that they've developed that were basically indicating these three risk levels. As you can see also from the chart there, they followed a cohort of students between 2007 to 2011, and in every given year, they found that those students who had at least one course with course signals basically profited for about, in terms of the numbers of students who made it through the process, about 15 to 20%. So this was one of these kind of well-known success stories, hit many kind of media, but also hit some other media in a kind of negative context I'm going to touch on a bit later in my talk. Another one, which really went farther and tried to address the challenge of potentially better teaching. And that's basically something which was developed at the University of Michigan. In their context, they primarily wanted to address a different type of problem. They didn't have a retention problem. They have about 94% of students who are succeeding, and their failures are those who are transfers to Harvard or Stanford or other universities in terms of basically really having some of the top students. So what was happening in their case, they wanted to address a challenge for students for whom science was not a major, yet they would be asked to take at least 2 to 3 courses in sciences. So for example, psychology or biology students. So for those students, they would typically be slightly intimidated, and also it would be setting like lower goals in the science courses in comparison to their home disciplines. So for them, they wanted to kind of assist these students and help them to increase the success in that process. So the outcome for them was to be better than expected to achieve inside of those courses. So for those students, then what they were trying to do, they were pretty much collecting a huge database of experiences of the other students who were in similar shoes in the previous years. So for example, asking students who were in psychology to take a chemistry course and then provide what kind of learning strategies they were following. They intentionally collected that type of information because they were doing research on public health, which indicated that people are much more inclined to accept advice from their peers than from experts. Thus, they wanted to kind of have this kind of advice to come from their more experienced peers who already went through the same process rather than from the teaching staff. So the second thing that they also implemented in that system was when they were sending these messages to students, they were also providing motivational part, which is built in something which is called self-determination theory, trying to provide a rationale why, for example, it is important to study biology for sociology students. And also provide them with a bit of kind of autonomy, support, and empathy in terms of understanding that this could be a bit challenging and hard to rationalize for you, that you are a psychologist who is taking this type of a class. However, these are the kind of reasons that other students as well find this course beneficial. A long story short is that they've been now using this system for at least 5 years, and they are reporting consistently improvement of students in terms of their grades for about half a letter grade, which basically translates to about 5%, or particularly these students for whom they were primarily targeting the system. So these are really some promising stories of the use of learning analytics across the sector. Obviously, learning analytics is something that has attracted lots of interest. For me, who was an academic who was doing research for many years in relevant areas, and lots of, I think, exciting technical work, all my research became quite relevant once we actually kind of founded learning analytics. And all of a sudden, I was kind of presented with opportunities to talk to many senior leaders inside of institutions, because all of a sudden we are trying to deliver some promise. But the question is, in spite of some of these interesting successes, is it really everything that's rosy in the learning analytics land? Are we doing all these things so brilliantly and beautifully that we don't have any particular challenge? So yesterday I talked about one group of challenges that is more related to the systemic adoption and the challenges that we are experiencing inside of institutions. Today, I want to talk about slightly different challenges. And those are challenges that are primarily related to validity of our learning analytics and the work which we are doing there. And the second one is also the quality and the type of feedback. Because in the end of the day, feedback is what we promised to deliver when we were also setting up learning analytics. And in many cases, that's really what we are meaning when we are talking about optimizing our learning. And at the same time, if you also want to understand learning, what's the validity of our learning analytics? Why I chose these two, don't ask me. I mean, I was thinking to discuss about many different promises, but then I had a limited number of time, and I'm hoping to be within the time that I was allowed for today. So let's dive into the first challenge that I want to discuss, validity. So how can we look into the validity of learning analytics? I think one of these critical dimensions when you are looking into research, but in terms of learning analytics, that validity has a critical implication also for practice as well as we're talking about generalizability, the extent to which we can potentially generalize some of these results. Those are good example of the attempt to try to generalize results in early days of the kind of proliferation of learning analytics and the whole WESST. There was an initiative funded by the Gates Foundation called Open Academic Analytics Initiative. Their goal was to build a big, beautiful predictive model that would be kind of created on a training set that would come from one institution and then be deployed across the board. Those were the ideas many institutions had in the early days. So they didn't really deliver that promise. So what was the challenge? They basically trained them all on a small liberal arts college, upstate New York, and they basically had a small population of students who were coming typically from higher socioeconomic levels of families, and also then they tried to deploy that model into the community colleges that were serving to lower socioeconomic status students who were also taking their classes in very large classrooms. Not only did the accuracy of these predictive models drop significantly, but also even the predictors that were significant in one institution were not really that relevant in another institution. So this is the first example. The other example where we are talking about generalizability, everybody is kind of, at least in the early days, very focused on something which is called social network analysis. So social networks are everywhere. People are trying to establish these social networks based on online discussions. In other cases, we, for example, show that social networks can be even established and analyzed and even proved to be kind of significantly explain the population, the grade average points, if we are even extracted based on the joint enrollments into certain classes. So while there is lots of promise with learning analytics and the use of social network analysis, that promise is really primarily related to the point that I'm going to create these social networks, then I'm going to try to understand who is central in these networks, or what is my centrality score, and then I'm going to try to correlate that centrality score with student success. Plenty of studies, hundreds of studies in the field of learning analytics and general kind of educational research. What is really common here across all these studies is that there are no consistent effects. So while, for example, in some studies, betweenness is central and significantly associated with the student's success, in others is not. Also, in some other studies, like, for example, where you find contradictory results. A degree is positively associated, degree is negatively associated with certain student success. So why is that happening, and how we are actually studying student validity, and why we are not getting any consistent results? There is another thing, and that's related to not necessarily generalizability, but actually what kind of conclusions can we derive from the findings that we have in the studies. So for example, the example that I was talking about, core signals. There was a study published at like 2012. I was a program chair, I must admit, on that conference. Yet it attracted a lot of negative publicity as well, by basically pointing to the fact that the paper itself was making inferences based on the statistics that were available in the paper that couldn't be made. They were primarily attributing the causal effect of the use of core signals, while that causal effect could not be determined, first of all, based on their study design, and secondly, based on the types of statistics that they were using inside of their study. Nobody denied the promise of the use of technology, but everybody was actually challenging them on the methodological stances, as well as also potential biases that were induced. When you basically stick to certain type of things, then you want to do it even more. But those who don't have that type of opportunity, for example, or they are not aware of the opportunity that the core signals could afford, they wouldn't really get that opportunity anyways to know it unless they are differently taught. Then there was a paper as well, and I believe Joseph published some work, did some work with Justin Wright. He basically didn't directly talk about learning analytics in his paper. He was primarily criticizing or critiquing, better to say, the work that was available inside of the movie area, where we are collecting terabytes, petabytes of data, yet we are hardly making any significant improvements in our kind of science of learning and the ways how we are enhancing our understanding of learning. That goes really well even to the next point that I made even yesterday, that in many cases, we are seeing lots of basically emphasis on just the beautiful algorithms and the magic that algorithms can do potentially for us, instead of really kind of focusing why is that so. So yes, I gave you an example of many organizations are setting up businesses around learning analytics, and they're all different organizations saying, well, you know, with the dispensing of technology, we still deep learning, and it doesn't gives you all the answers. But what question? We don't know. And the organizations of that kind really don't have something to tell you. They provide you with some of the direct things like attention, but we say our institution doesn't care so much about attention. We have and so in such cases, you really need to kind of go away from this notion that I'm going to just apply this beauty of algorithms and I'm going to get some answers. You rather need to go back to the basic questions. There's even like one ethical dilemma that Peter Ryman, in his paper published last year, in a journal which is actually published by NIE, Practice Learning and Research and Practice. And it has basically something which is quite fundamental. Can you use the descriptions of the past to prescribe value? I think that is quite relevant in one of the ways of things past. However, we should then try to intervene and change things. And therefore, the moment changing our the question of the extent to which the validity of the models that we had used in the past is applicable in the future. That's really one of these questions we need to pay attention. The second challenge, you thought that I was going to let's wait to see what I say. So the is something else you might manage. But when you go to most of these that are related to learning analytics, you will hear very few people saying the word feedback. There's another word that is common. Dashboard. Dashboard. So like everyone says, oh, it's not dashboard. Dashboard will do that. Dashboard provide a lot of answers. And they're probably right in some sense. How would they places where they are? We basically started some ideas. In 2005, we were focusing on a tool which we called essentially didn't really know the name of the field. But we were also focusing on a lot of different types of visualization. But the thing is, why is the research so one thing is that we are finding in the literature that dashboards actually talking about. There was a study done in personnel. Implementation for some of these small available dashboards. And for some reason, we are fixated on the dashboards that are presenting me with respect to the class. That's really what is happening. I don't know why. But anyways, that's the kind of norm that we're just never going to streaming dashboards, so that's counting. So the study showed that took performance when they saw that there was slightly above the class average. Although they were underperforming with respect to their goals and their previous GPA, they actually found they were doing okay. So meaning that most of the people don't know how to make the decisions related to their personal learning based on these types of dashboards. That's one study. Another study, which was done at the University of Michigan, showed that presenting dashboards of this kind over time basically resulted in decline of youth motivation. There was another study which shows also that those students who know when they saw that they were so behind in class, there was self-examination. So this is really one of the critical things. There's other critical things. Just created. They're hard to test first. And then they're out. And even when they're out, they're valued for example. So these are the way how assist us to improve and optimize our learning. So that's another thing. Dashboards are also designed for teaching style. We found in our literature that some of these dashboards grew for teaching style. However, recently we are working with the next learning services provider. They provide us with their dashboards as well. And they generated some of these predictive models. They also had a very reasonable kind of discourse with us, and they understood everything. But it came down to some of the dashboards when we were presenting them to teach us how they had no clue. Quite honestly, some of these features required quite considerable knowledge of statistics and machine learning. So we basically sit there together with my students who have all the background in machine learning, and then we were trying to make interpretations. What some of these predictors can. So these dashboards are not necessarily suited for those for whom they should be. Those who should be using them. So my kind of naive, expectations by all sides, that we really need to move from this kind of program, and they can present it, and also we have very machine learning to generate some predictive models. And so let's try something that'll go in this sort of finance. All right, so this is my kind of critique, or the type of challenge. This is not me just saying it is relevant from the perspective of learning analytics. We also find in the kind of general practitioners and others that are also identifying issues that are related to data science. There was a recent law a few days ago, which they also suggested as challenges that are related to science as well. So it comes down to collection. So what data can we have? And instead basically the power and should be satisfied with the quality of data that is available inside the systems or not. It also comes down to differentiation. And always thinking what kind of biases some of our institutions are making. And just the kind of representation of some of these data can be quite simple, whether we are using Boolean representations. So there are certain things that can be available in terms of that. And eventually, I will also give about measures as well, for and similar class models that are available. And then we also talking about that he managed get in business versus provided impeccably accurate model, yet the return is connected from the actual problem that they were trying to solve. If it's truly based on math rather than the systems and the complexity, there was basically behind it in ways how that system could be improved for our science. Right. So you're still somewhat, all right? So I'm going to try now to give a little interaction way that I was trying to think about learning analytics. One of these critical things is that I've been telling this thing for almost 40 years. And learning analytics is about learning. But for some reason, we are forgetting that. And what I mean by this learning analytics is about learning. I think initially in early days, we were trying to kind of build a link with the literature on learning, teaching, and education. But over the course of years, I had a chance to write a paper in the special issue that Jen Tan and Elizabeth Poe edited earlier this year in the Journal of Learning Research Practice. And in which we try to but they are direct with respect to some of these two challenges that I like to talk about. So the first, what I want to emphasize is that learning analytics is not just data science. It is equally a theory, and it is equally a science. And when it comes to theory, you really need to follow these two ways. Our small theory is something from our practices. Something we try to expect from our research, from our practice for education, something which comes from the culture of the institution or the region where our institution is. And also big of the theories. They're talking about theories that are commonly available in the research literature. I'm going to talk a lot about theories that come, for example, from self-regulated learning research. Whereas which tries to find ways how we are going about making our decisions when it comes down to learning choices, study strategies, and the approaches that we are using to create high-quality learning products. But then, in many cases, also we're going to refer to the theories of social capital, or the theories that are relevant to social constructivism. There's another dimension, equally critical, and that's design. This is critical because we're also talking about how we are communicating our analytics to stakeholders. And basically, the dimension highlights are really two critical components. The first critical component is learning design. We need to think about ways how we are designing experiences for our learners, and how we are providing tools for them to engage with the types of resources. And basically, it's extremely relevant for our goal to create our technologies and also using learning analytics to feed it back to learners. Because the moment you use learning analytics in the environment, that intrinsically becomes also parts of our learning design. Second component of design is our education. The way how we are designing our environments, the way how we are embedding our analytics, or the way we are creating. And third dimension of design component is related to design. We cannot make causal inferences if we are not able to have study designs that are other aspects of inferences. So we really need to think about ways how we are setting up designs that is equal for research as it is for practice. So let's now go back to these two challenges. What are those directions when it comes down to these dimensions? Theory, design, data science. So one really critical thing about kind of dynamic intervention I'm talking about, and with respect to validity, is we know from education, one size fits all doesn't work. I'm going to say this kind of phrase every program.
Yeah. And this is really critical, I imagine. Not only for the individual, any other individual, but also those, say, upper levels, different courses are different in terms of their study design. They're also different in terms of this. They're relevant. We know them. They are disciplinary. How different disciplines are following different patterns. But we are also going. We are talking about different institutions have different structures, different ways institutions for building with respect to technology. Also, how certain things are happening in particular institutions, and they are also sort of internal things. And in Europe, a lot of culture, which has kind of political context and incentives that institutions are making their decisions, but they are also serving money versus other types of population. So one of these dimensions is more design. What are design is a bit of design, but from the literature also on subject learning known as well, that conditions are those that are shaping our choices in terms of decisions that we are making about practices and strategies that we are going to make. That really comes directly from the theory of self-regulated learning. I feel winning a house design around the model which is called codes, and that is based on conditions. There are also internal conditions as well, that we have different levels of motivation, changes over time, and also that we have different levels of knowledge and so on. So we were running a study which we want to just kind of reiterate that fact and show the importance of building and using predictive modeling techniques that can account for this kind of, if you wish, hierarchical nature of data. That we wanted to kind of understand that different courses have different priorities. So we ran a study with non-large enrollment courses, in which basically we initially had about 5,400 students. We built one model, and we said, well, they're probably going to respond something. We did, and this is about 12% of their abilities, grades. However, in terms of insignificant research, explains for example, the number of organs into the LMS. That was really one of those very few kind of variables almost open source. So this is really what we take these very flat technologies. But then when we use it today, we account for the hierarchical differences and the contextual differences across the board. And in some cases, we were able to explain almost 75%. They were very important courses, and also told courses structure told us what relevant actually change my practice. However, when we told some other courses structures, in courses we expect 0% the variability based on the interaction students with their learning management system. They told us, why did you even waste your time to look into data related to Moodle, because nothing is happening there. We designed everything to happen on Facebook. Right? And so in order to wash away the context, we're going to make some fairly silly inferences when it comes out to data. Going back to social network analysis, I said that many people came with this kind of idea that some measures is correlated with performance. That's why, but however, and the literature also says, however, the literature also another thing that everybody for some reason forgets to do or doesn't do for some reason in their research. And it is that deep networks that are creating bad based on the centrality are built on deep ties. That comes from the fundamental work of Dragan Gašević in the 70s. It basically indicated that it is really deep ties. Those are people with whom you don't have really good foundation. They're not straight, but rather they're creating opportunities, offering different perspectives to the problems. So this is exactly the type of thing that we then want to check. And there are some mechanisms in social network analysis as well. It's kind of data science. It's really very detailed. We want data science, but we need to use it also wisely. And when we are using it in that way and connecting to the theory, then we can make some actually inferences as well.
So in 2016, we published a paper in which we wanted to test whether networks were based on weak ties or not, and then whether that translates into the benefits for students in terms of the association to network centrality and students' performance. We were very fortunate to have a MOOC that was offered by the Edinburgh together with a European university on Scratch program. The course was identical, except that it was offered as the Spanish and English version of the course. It was offered simultaneously at the same time. The same content, everything except language. English speaking version was kind of about 60,000 students. Spanish version was kind of about 33,000 students. Both courses again the identity of students who completed the course. When it came down to social method analysis, however, we applied something which is called exponential number of graphs that also can help us take something which is called that is to say whether there is a significant prevalence of something which is called strong ties. We found in the English version of the course there was a significant prevalence of these strong ties. While in the Spanish version and so we then tested our hypothesis. We then said that in the course in which there was no significant strong ties, there would be a significant benefit of the network centrality. And where there was basically strong ties, they were not. That was proved in the analysis as well. So completely tested. So we need to really kind of account for these things that are coming from theory, otherwise results not be quite beneficial. We need to also think about further steps and why is the reason why one course tended to cluster and the other one they didn't. Our qualitative analysis showed that in the Spanish-speaking course, everybody spoke the same language, and that students didn't tend to cluster around the languages and the cultural similarities, because similarities in terms of the culture they were fairly smaller. However, in the English-speaking course, students still tended to kind of find a kind of peers who were from the similar regions and frequently also used their own languages to communicate with each other. And thus they created these kind of small cliques, if you wish, and then there was no really benefits from the entire network in terms of the opportunities afforded by students. There's another critical thing for us, and it is who is making decisions about digital traces that we are collecting inside of our learning management systems. That's really rarely done by those who are trained to collect data, design instruments, research instruments that are relevant for learning and teaching. This decision is typically made just by software engineers. In many cases, because they need these digital traces to make sure whether their technologies are working or not, or whether it's kind of certain service which is not working. But this is really not something very relevant if we want to make sure that we are making suitable decisions as well as provide good insight that is relevant for our research and practice. And the first component of that is that we need to have digital traces that are linked with our learning designs. That means really we need to know what is the pedagogical purpose of a certain resource, not whether a certain user just open a certain page. But what was the purpose? Was it kind of responsible, or was it an exercise, or a pro activity, or was it just a planning courses? So these are the kinds of things that are relevant. Once we have that initial piece of metadata that is describing some of our short traces, then we can also take smarter alternatives or any